talk about ways of improving at debate and trying to figure out the various ways that we can all improve as coaches, as students, and all of the various aspects of Lincoln Douglas debate. This podcast is a way of having a good time and maybe even learning something.
Our podcast is for anyone looking to improve their understanding of high school Lincoln Douglas debate. So whether you are a local circuit debater trying to deepen your understanding of debate, whether you're someone who goes around the country debating, whether you're a coach who just wants some good advice about teaching debate, or just someone who wants to have a good time with us while thinking about debate, this podcast is for you.
We're super excited that you could join us. Now, a little bit about us. My name is Martin Sigalo. I debated for 4 years at a high school in Florida, doing Lincoln Douglas debate all 4 years. I went to college at Emory University in Atlanta, coaching a bunch of high school Lincoln Douglas debate while I was there. And now I'm a full-time debate coach back at my old high school. And I was pretty good, but I think my students are better.
And as I said earlier, my name is Lawrence. I'm currently a junior at the University of Oklahoma. I debated for 4 years in Lincoln Douglas debate at a tiny high school called Bartlesville High School in Oklahoma. I now spend the summers working for Victory Briefs, and I'm also an assistant coach at a few high schools. You'll find out more about us as this podcast continues. Our topic for this particular week is judge adaptation. You should join us for our exciting adventure as we dive into the suburban pool of figuring out your judges and figuring out tips and tricks for adapting to the types of judges that are out there.
Suburban pool A. Are we going to go off the deep end? So we're going to have types of episodes on this podcast related to what we're talking about sort of generally. Are we going to improve your skills at debate? Are we going to improve your way of preparing for debates? There's a lot of ways to improve your game at Lincoln Douglas debate, and Lawrence and I are going to have a nice little trip through a lot of different ways of doing that. Now, today is an episode of what we'll call an Art of War episode, where we're talking about getting the skills you need to get ahead. This is one of a few different topics we'll do on this, and it's the one we're going to start out. We decided to start with this topic because it was a sort of generally accessible topic to a lot of different people, and we think it's extremely important for any successful debater.
So we'll obviously start off by asking the question, what is adaptation? And I'll answer it myself. Good question. It's convincing a wide variety of judges to vote for you. And we think that's sort of the easy, simplistic way to understand what adaptation is. Obviously, there's more to that, and that's what we'll explore for the rest of this podcast.
The basic idea is, and I'm sure that everyone listening to the podcast knows this already, but, judges vote for people for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah, a lot of different reasons.
Losing a debate basically means you gave the wrong sorts of reasons. The reasons that you were giving for why a judge should vote for you maybe didn't line up with what the judge was actually thinking about.
Yeah, I once had a judge vote against me because I, quote, didn't sound professional enough to him. I think that was the entirety of the RFD written on paper. It was quite weird to receive.
That sounds kind of rough. Can you how does this relate to adaptation? How could you adapt to that person?
Well, I mean, it is kind of my fault because he was looking for a student or a debater who took themselves really seriously and seemed like a confident student who was invested in debate because he was a parent judge that judged a lot in Oklahoma.
Oh.
And I guess in this particular debate, I just wasn't the type of debater he wanted to see. And I should have been more serious, more professional. I mean, I probably was kind of serious, kind of professional, just not what this judge wanted, not the sort of presentation style that this judge wanted. So I should have adapted a little bit better.
Yeah. I've had plenty of decisions that are like that. And the main takeaway is that really we all have had decisions that are like that. And part of the main goal of debate is trying to figure out ways to get even the most sort of random people to vote for you. Now, that said, and I think Lawrence will agree with me here, but in our experience, judges are really influenced by the same sorts of things. I think debaters can have a tendency to get really hung up when they get, one really bad decision that makes no sense and kind of just decide that they'll just do whatever they want instead of trying to adapt to specific judges. But really, the whole point of judge adaptation is once we expand our perspectives on what are the sorts of judges that these people are, or what are the same sorts of things that can influence judges, then really you can appeal to a lot more judges than really we think we can. We're going to talk to you about how to figure out what the judge wants and, sort of what do judges want in general, if that makes sense.
Which I think begs the question, what do judges want?
I do like begging questions, Lawrence. Here's an answer to that question. Convincing people of things, generally, is divided into 3 categories. And this is a very important thing to remember. This will also help you, I guess, if you're sort of wondering about Greek philosophy, how it works. There's this guy, I don't know if you heard of him, named Aristotle. And he had 3 ways of classifying different ways of convincing people, or what he called rhetoric. These are Greek words, and I obviously don't know the root because I don't know Greek, but these words, and it's important to know what these words are, even though you'll never maybe even say them in a debate round. Logos, pathos, and ethos.
Yeah, so what we're going to tell you now is sort of what the components of logos, pathos, ethos are, and then we'll describe sort of how to use these sort of ideas, these sort of rhetoric ideas in debate rounds to effectively adapt and persuade a wide variety of judges. If any of you are in like 10th or 11th grade English, I'm sorry, this might sound a little bit like what your high school English teacher is about to tell you, but we're going to give you a unique perspective that's specific to judge adaptation in high school Lincoln Douglas debate.
I definitely did not learn that in high school.
Oh, really? Our English teacher definitely made us like cover this, and I was just like, wow, I've never heard this before. Well, JK, I read like debate books that taught this sort of stuff. So.
I was totally left out to dry. My 10th grade English class was basically useless. I learned way more in debate than I learned in 10th grade English.
This might be the first time where the Oklahoma education system taught us something useful ever.
Well, the Florida education system ain't much better.
So the first sort of component of rhetoric and persuasion is logos. So it's just basically logic. You should make logical arguments. It's the general idea that human beings, to some degree, are persuaded by logic and supportive evidence because people tend to agree with you and they tend to be persuaded by you and listen to you if they think that you're right, and they tend to think that you're right if you have some logic behind what you're saying. Like, obviously in debate you have to make some like logical arguments. It seems kind of silly that we have to sort of point this out, and this seems like obvious, but for some reason people don't make very logical arguments in debate a lot of times. So this is sort of an important thing to talk about, because even though that's the most obvious of the components of persuasion and rhetoric in debate, sometimes people overlook it and just don't make logical arguments. So step 1, make some logical arguments.
And obviously this is not something that's terribly difficult, but I do just want to emphasize one point that Lawrence made in like a specific context. In a lot of our local circuits, we come across debaters who, if you kind of think about it, are maybe a little cynical in the way that they approach making arguments. And here's what I mean by that. I think that some of these debaters think that when you're debating in front of, a judge who is maybe less experienced, or someone who's not a full-time debate coach, something like that, that you just shouldn't really make logical arguments, that's not the important bit, that instead you should try to appeal to the judge's emotions and a bunch of stuff that we'll talk about later. But one thing that I think is very important to understand is, look, you're not debating in front of literal idiots. That's not a thing that happens at local tournaments. Even if you are, people are just more likely to agree with what you're saying if they think that you're right. So even the people that are most persuadable doesn't mean you should give up on making arguments. And that's, I think, just one thing that we want to underscore.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sort of seems like pretentious for a high school student to be like, wow, I'm just so much smarter than this parent in the back of the room who could easily, be a doctor, a lawyer, someone who actually, or like a business person who has lots of intelligence. They may not think exactly like you, but, they're still persuaded by logic. And yeah, you shouldn't give up on people just because they don't think exactly like you.
Okay, now the second type of rhetoric is pathos. So logos, like log, that root of the word, is the root of our word logic, and pathos is like passion. The general idea of pathos is that it is emotional appeals. People don't only listen to what people are saying because they're logical, and I'm sure that every bit of personal experience that you have, once you really think about it, kind of confirms what we're saying, you know? For example, people tell me that I shouldn't eat at Taco Bell, but that doesn't stop, passion from seizing me and driving me to some cheap tacos. Taco Bell's a very important part of my life. Well, not really,
Well,
but
actually, interesting tidbit. Business Insider actually recently reported that Taco Bell is now amongst the healthiest of the fast food chains because they advertise all of the unhealthy stuff, but their new menu is actually full of really healthy options that they don't advertise to people because they obviously want to like keep up their unhealthy brand. But you could actually get cheap tacos at Taco Bell and not feel bad about yourself because it's healthy now.
that just might be the excuse that I needed this holiday season. um, so just to dive into pathos a little bit, um, logic isn't the only thing that influences people. Human beings are creatures of emotion, and this goes for you regardless of how smart you are, of how experienced of a judge you are. Convincing a judge, making a judge feel real feelings to want to vote for you is really just an indispensable skill. And part of this has to do with evolution and kind of the way that we as beings evolved from other beings. And, you know, there's some evolutionary psychology explanations going on here, and I do sort of have a little bit of a problem with these because I tend to find you can find an evolutionary psychology explanation for everything. But I think this one makes a lot of sense. We, as beings, are sort of hardwired to listen to stories. Stories about past experience are a really important way of transmitting information, or I guess they used to be back in hunter-gatherer days / when I was a debater. Um, we listen to stories just more than we listen to other people. We are hardwired to be interested in and affected by stories. Um, so Lawrence, which one of these, plucks your heartstrings with, pluck more? 30 people were robbed today in Winter Park, which is an area around where I live. Or 25 helpless citizens were brutally mugged in broad daylight, their savings ruined, and them scarred for life.
So, as someone with virtually no emotional connection to the outside world, it's kind of hard to say. But I definitely imagine that the more vivid and emotion-laden description would sort of, quote, pluck my heartstrings more or sort of stir a greater sense of empathy within me. And I suspect that I'm correct, that most of you thought that the emotionally charged terms of like helpless and brutally mugged, sort of triggered the more empathetic
Brutal.
side of you. That prevented you from just sort of distancing yourself. Like, oh no, 30 people were robbed today. Another news story that I don't have to care about. But when you sort of introduce the human element, that sort of emotional, empathetic element of like helpless citizens and brutally mugged and sort of gets you to emotionally attach to them, then suddenly you care a bit more. Sort of as Martin was talking about how you're now interested and now affected by these stories.
Yeah, and I think, it's important to note that even though the 25 people sounded like a lot better, if we're being honest, if we were just going from a pure logos perspective, that's 25 versus 30 people. 25 should be less. You should think that that's maybe less important. But the way that I put it made us sort of psychologically think that the 25 were the most important. But anyway, enough about pathos, although I could passionately rant about passionate ranting all day. What's the third pillar of persuasion, Lawrence?
Well, so most of us are kind of familiar with logos, pathos, sort of intuitively, even if you don't know the Greek roots or Aristotle or all of the nerdy stuff that we've just been talking about. I think a lot of people ignore that there's sort of a third element to persuasion. It's not just the words that are coming out of your mouth and the logical arguments and the emotions that you trigger that come out of your mouth. The third part is that judges don't just vote for the logical and emotional parts of an argument. They also have to vote for who's presenting the argument. And this sort of leads into the third part of rhetoric or persuasion, which is ethos. And the third part is just the general idea that people tend to vote for people with credibility, that you will have moral authority, that you are someone they want to vote for or agree with. It's like when role models tell you something, you tend to believe them, and why you also hate listening to people you don't like. If you don't like someone, even if they tell you something very logically or even very passionately, you tend to disagree with them. So, for example, I tend to believe things that Bill Nye the Science Guy tells me about science, because even though I don't necessarily believe or know or can logically, validate every single step in the chain that Bill Nye the Science Guy uses, because I'm not a science person, I tend to believe that Bill Nye the Science Guy is correct about what he says because he has moral credibility. Not only is he incredibly intelligent and well-versed in his field with, lots of respect from the scientific community, he's also a nice person, and you just want to listen to what Bill Nye the Science Guy has to say. He sounds like he knows what's up. He's believable, because we all know that Bill Nye the Science Guy wouldn't lie to you. So
Well. Let me rein you back in there, Lawrence. So obviously you weren't listening to Bill Nye the Science Guy on everything. Like if Bill Nye told you to, I don't know, jump off a bridge, if he said that would help the goals of science, would you do that, Lawrence?
So yeah, exactly. Like there are obviously constraints. None of these factors are individually the sort of sufficient condition for persuasion. Like I would probably believe Bill Nye on an ethos level. Like I'd just be like, oh yeah, Bill told me to jump off a bridge. Let's go do it. And I'd probably consider it. But then when you sort of consider the other elements, like more importantly, the logos elements, I'd just be like, well, this doesn't seem particularly, logical. Why am I being told to jump off a bridge? Now, for example, if Bill Nye was like, don't worry, it's like a small bridge. There's like, an air mattress at the bottom to catch your fall. I'm really just trying to interested in measuring air resistance. I'd be like, all right, let's go for it. But if he's like, yeah, just jump off this multi-story bridge. There's nothing at the bottom. You'll probably die. Then I'd be a little less likely to listen to Bill Nye because it doesn't cohere with the sort of logical side of this argument. Because Bill has tons of moral credibility, but even that can't override the basic intuition that jumping off a bridge for no reason is not a good idea.
That's awesome. So Lawrence, do you think that there are like logos debaters, and then there are like pathos debaters and ethos debaters, and then like there's kind of like a rock paper scissors thing going on where like the pathos debater beats the logos debater, and the logos debater beats the ethos debater, or something like that. Let's say I'm a debater. Should I try to master one of those two things and then hope that goes the distance for me? Just like put all of my energy into just like mastering logos. I just read all the logic textbooks available. So what do you think about that? Does that sound good?
Well, so starting with the first part, like, are there just logos debaters, pathos debaters, ethos debaters? Yeah, absolutely. There are some debaters who, can present very logical, convincing arguments. They do tons of research. They have tons of evidence. But at no point in time do they ever try to sell the sort of more emotional side of things, or they try to convince other people that they're sort of a moral credible figure, like that they have ethos. And there are people that are pathos more laden, and so like they just talk about the emotional side of things but don't cite evidence. And there are people who are ethos debaters who just like sound really confident but like don't really say anything else. And so just like a good basketball player is really not going to be successful by just mastering passing, but like not shooting or dribbling. It is possible to be just a logos, pathos, or ethos debaters, but a good debater really isn't going to be successful, especially at adaptation, just by being good at one of those three elements of persuasion.
Oh, okay. So I see
like
what you're
the best
saying.
persuaders.
You're basically saying like, so there just are people who are currently kind of like put themselves in those camps, but that you don't recommend that you invest your energy just into doing one or two of those things. You think that we should still try to become well-rounded debaters. Is that
Absolutely.
Is that accurate?
So like when I was younger, I played basketball, which is hard to believe because I look,
that's
not athletic at all. I was actually pretty good at shooting because I went to the Boys and Girls Club and trained at shooting. And so I actually pretty solid like free throw percentage. Like I could make threes pretty well. And I actually had a pretty decent shot, like a lot of skill in it, but I had virtually no aggression or muscle mass. So I could not, like, for example, force my way to make a layup because against the bigger people that were there because I had none of those skills, and my dribbling skills were, left something to be desired. And so even though I could make good basketball shots, I don't think at any point in time I would ever consider myself a good basketball player because I had no dribbling ability and I had virtually no passing ability or like no aggression. I'd one out of the many features necessary to be a good basketball player. And I think a lot of debaters are kind of like that, where they just master one of these, but not all of them. And so they're really not great debaters. They might be good debaters, but maybe not great.
Well, I certainly share that with you. Not being a good basketball player. My only experience playing basketball was with my friend growing up, and he had this thing called make it take it, where if you made a shot, you got the ball next time, which was enormously unfair to me because not only could I not score, I also couldn't prevent him from scoring. So it was rigged. It was a rigged game, as they say. Um, yeah, with ethos, I think, and with pathos and with logos, I think, as a judge, I have a unique perspective on that because I could sort of tell when a debater is doing, one of those couple things. And I can tell where they're putting emphasis. And the debaters that I just at the end of the debate think are best are really the debaters who have done a lot of different ones of those. They've
Yeah, I
managed
agree.
to
Yeah.
be well rounded and stuff like that. And I think, oh, you're not just a one trick pony, which is, I guess, a pony that only does one trick. Is that like if you only read Kant? Are you just a one trick pony in debate?
I guess.
Is that your
I'm.
trick? Is it really a trick?
I mean, if you're just
Hmm.
really good at that moral philosophy, I mean, maybe it's not a trick. Maybe you're just like really smart about that one moral philosophy, and you learn how to defend it. But
Hmm.
yeah, and I agree. Like as a judge, I guess maybe if I had to pick one, I'm definitely, more on the logo side of things. But a debater that is pure logos with no ethos or no pathos is just not persuasive. Like, whether I'm judging, in Chicago or Texas or, local Oklahoma, it a debater that just doesn't have all three of those things is just really not as persuasive as a debater who only has one of those things. A debater that has logos, pathos, ethos is persuasive, and it's not that hard to imagine like debaters with tons of ethos but like no logos. Like you'd always sort of want to vote for that guy because he sounds super good and it's like got a lot of moral credibility because he sounds like he's done research on the topic when in fact he's done nothing. But then there's like nothing to vote for, nothing of value, and similarly, like there's debaters with like lots of logos but no pathos or ethos, and it's just so hard to vote for these people because they just aren't fully persuasive.
Yeah, and I just think the key lesson to get here is that all judges are persuaded by all three of these things, um, even if they think that they're not.
Yeah.
So you should always try to do the maximum three things. And I think we spent enough time on this. Let's move down into how to both identify what types of judges there are, or, well, sort of, and or how to debate in order to maximize sort of logos, pathos, and ethos, stuff like that. We each have had rounds, very important rounds, that are basically completely decided by reading of judges that we did in the middle of the debate. At least I can speak for myself. Um, I was debating at a tournament in Florida my my senior year of high school, and I walked into the room, and I had some idea of who the judge was. It was pretty vague. They said that they were a policy judge, and they were fine with like various things. So I started to read a case, and I looked up at my judge, which is a very important thing that you're going to need to do. And she just wasn't having any of it. She was barely writing anything I was saying down. So in the middle of my speech, I had two cases that had sort of similar frameworks, and I just reached into my folder and I pulled out a different case, a case that was intended for slower judges, and I read that case instead, dramatically slowed down, and was able to win a debate that if I hadn't been paying attention to the judge, really would not have paid attention to. Managed to dodge that bullet, as they say.
Yeah, so my experience with reading judges, not quite as interesting a story as Martin's here, because I never once read a different case in the middle of reading a case in a round. For me, it was just a little more simplistic, which was just I was in state finals my senior year, and I was the negative in the middle of the 2&R, answering some part of the affirmatives framework, and I was just making this short, blippy argument, and I don't really remember exactly what this argument said, because at the time I didn't really think it was that important. It was just like some random argument about why I thought my value criterion was a preferable one to theirs. And while I'm making this argument, the judge on the far left just looks up and starts nodding along to this argument that I'm making. And I'm confused why, because I thought at the time this was a 5-10 second, very short argument. But instead, because this judge was just nodding along so much, I spent another 20 seconds on this argument. And this ended up becoming an issue in the judge's ballot, where he's like, this is one of the reasons why I think the negative is winning the framework debate decisively, or something along those lines. And it was an argument that I did not give any weight at all. But because I sort of looked along with this big old nod that this judge was giving me, I was able to, in the middle of the round, sort of adapt and, better persuade this judge.
Yeah, so very important to figure out what your judges are, and to try to figure that out both before the debate and, in the middle of the debate. Lawrence, let's move on to the next topic, where we talked about logos, pathos, and ethos in the last segment, and let's talk about sort of how to improve your skills at these things. And
yeah, absolutely.
I think, so to start out, logos. It's important. Here's the thing with logos. Logos is not really how logical your arguments are, but really it's how logical does the judge think your arguments are. Really, it's all in the judge's head. If your argument's completely illogical, but the judge thinks you're right when you've made the argument, that's a logos argument. And to that end, it's important to make your arguments seem logical. Even if your argument isn't logical, or even if your argument sort of is logical, but you aren't really doing a lot of work to explain why it's logical or why it's true, then really that isn't going to be persuasive on a logos level. And so here's the key thing. It's important to convey the logical steps of your argument. Your argument is logical. Well, maybe it's not, but it should be. You want to show that it's logical. Don't just say that it's logical. You want to make it very clear that your argument has this part. This causes this, this causes this. That means this. Just that sort of logical structure to your point will do really well for you when trying to convey logos in debates. Needless to say, you should, of course, have good criterion warrants, have good evidence for your contentions, or even have arguments in your contentions that aren't evidence, that are sort of logical, explained, and stuff like that. But it's really important that you have a very strong attempt to organize what you're saying into logical points, so that what you're saying sort of appeals to the logical part of the judge. Anything you would add there, Lawrence?
Yeah, the judge should be, for one thing, able to repeat back to you what your argument was in a sort of logical, coherent fashion, without the judge thinking, wow, this argument is terrible. Why is this person making it? They should be able to think to themselves, yeah, these are very logical steps that they're making. They're pointing it out. Let me repeat back the argument, and it makes sense to me. And I think the other maybe small thing to add is just that, if you make good logical arguments, judges will feel smart that they sort of are following along with you. They're like, man, this is a good argument. I'm glad that someone put it in this way, or they made the logical steps in this way. They're doing such a good job of explaining it. And then when they feel smart following along with such good logos-based argumentation, they're also a little bit more likely to vote for you for that reason.
That's awesome. And that's so true. Making your judges feel smart is a truly underappreciated skill.
Yeah, absolutely. No parent wants to seem, silly or, less than intelligent to a high school student. So, if you can make them feel smart, it'll usually help boost it in your favor.
Yeah, it's great.
So I mean, I think logos is, fairly straightforward. There are a few small things that you probably hadn't thought about that Martin pointed out. So what we're going to talk about next is how to utilize pathos in debate. And there are a few components to this, and I'll start by talking about the importance of rhetoric, which is the words that resonate with your audience. You're choosing the correct words to make the arguments that you want to make, because how you say stuff matters. If Martin and I used much more bland, boring words throughout this entire podcast, you would most likely fall asleep and exit out of this podcast. But hopefully, we are choosing words that are more descriptive, more vivid, more, like intelligent sounding. And I hope we're picking, the rhetoric that helps convince people that Martin and I are telling you logical, important things that you should know for debate. And especially in the issue of pathos, I think how you say stuff really matters. So there's this debater from Oklahoma. His name was Nicky Holterman. He won nationals in 2015, NSDA nationals, that is. And he was very well known for having like an excellent pathos to his presentation. He was also really good at ethos and logos. Don't get me wrong. Like, his brother worked for a think tank. His parents were both professors. He was like a very charming, convincing person, generally speaking. But he had pathos on lockdown, and that was one thing you could not contest about Nicky. And in state finals, my junior year, this is when Nicky was a sophomore, I was debating him, and the last 30 seconds of Nicky's negative speech contained a statement that I don't know word for word, but sounded something along the lines of, "How many innocents will you sacrifice upon the altar of your moral purity before what you realize you are doing is nothing more than genocide?" Or something along those lines. And he said it so impactfully, and he chose words like altar of moral purity or like genocide or innocence, and like he just said a bunch of these sort of things, and I don't exactly remember the statement, but what I do remember is how that statement made me feel afterwards. I having to give the 2AR upon listening to this statement was like, well, I think I've lost. I think all of the judges are convinced that I am sacrificing too many innocents upon my altar of moral purity to win. And even though I don't remember
your altar.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish I had. Maybe I could have won this debate round if that had happened, because I did end up losing this debate round on a 2-1 decision. But it wasn't even so much the exact words that he picked. It was the fact that he chose the words in such an organized fashion that at the end you felt bad for voting for the affirmative, and you felt good for voting for the negative, and voting for Nicky. And I think this is like the important part of pathos. It's what your words make the judge feel. The judge should feel bad, for voting for your opponent. They should feel good for voting for you. And I absolutely understand why the judges felt bad for voting for me in that debate round, because of the way that he said it. Picking the correct words that sort of tug at the emotional heartstrings that people have and making people feel like good moral people, I think is a really important part of the pathos side.
As I've said sort of previously, I also think that telling things in the form of a story is important. And I'm not going to repeat that here, like why that's important, but here's how you would put that into effect. I think that when you are framing your points, you should make your points in sort of a cause-effect relationship. I would explain them in the context of sort of very real things. The difficulty of debate, and sort of one of the reasons why it's great, is that debate is kind of removed from the real world, in the sense that, like, you're in this room and you're going to be in the room for 45 minutes. You can talk about whatever you want, and then after you exit the room, things will be the same thing. But one thing that I want you guys to really do, guys and girls, of course, I'd like you to put what you're saying in the form of the real world as you can. Try to relate to the judge who is in a real world context and thinks about things through those ways. Tell a story, but don't tell a story about a place that doesn't exist. Tell a story about the world we live in, the world that the judge probably lives in and thinks about, and you will achieve a lot more than you probably thought that you would.
Yeah, Absolutely. So the debater that I coached last year for NSDA Nationals made it to semifinals that year. I think the thing that really set him apart from a lot of debaters was his ability to tell stories. And so, for one thing, the topic at Nationals was about immigration, whether or not there's a human right to immigrate. And he himself was actually an immigrant. And so he told, for some part of the debate, kind of a story about how if there were no right to immigration, that there's no guarantee that he wouldn't have, been in some poor Southeast Asian country, and he wouldn't have been able to debate here. If there wasn't a guaranteed right to immigration, he might be living in sort of a poor area in the world,
Wow.
and he wouldn't have the opportunity to come to America and sort of have opportunities that he has now. And it certainly wasn't the whole of his argument, but it was a moving enough statement that with a story about himself, a real person, that in fact after one debate a judge came up to him afterwards and like was almost crying and telling him about what a moving sort of speech that was. And I think that that sort of storytelling element is really, really important, where you make it about the real world and you talk about human natures and real people and connect the arguments, the sort of abstract arguments in the debate, to the judge.
That's great. That's so great. Hearing stories like that is just insane as a debate coach and a judge. Um, let's talk about ethos now. So we just talked about sort of the real people that are you and the person that you're trying to appeal to, or persons, as the case may be.
Yeah.
Now, I think that ethos, a lot of the ways of getting ethos are kind of difficult to nail down, but I think we have a couple of things here that will make you better at ethos. The first thing that sort of everyone will tell you is eye contact. You
Hmm.
know, we as humans, just getting back to my sort of psychology, bent here. But humans, I don't know if you notice this about them. This should be obvious to everyone. But if you stare at them in the eyes, they will feel like they're more connected to you. The reason that this is an ethos thing is that ethos is sort of really about empathy, not sympathy, empathy, trying to feel as another person feels. And there are specific psychological studies about the way that the neurons in your brain work. I think they're called mirror neurons, but there are some neurons in your brain that are specifically designed to sort of feel what you think another person is feeling. And eye contact is really critical to really test out how good your logos is and how good your pathos is. So eye contact, super important. And one thing that I think that, debaters say when I tell them this is, yeah, that's kind of obvious. And it is kind of obvious that it's important to maintain eye contact, but I don't think debaters quite realize how important it is. I would
Yeah.
sacrifice in a lot of debates, I would sacrifice making more arguments for eye contact. And I would do it every time. It's more important that the judge kind of gets you than it is that you make another point that they're not going to get.
Yeah. Um, and one sort of problem that a lot of people have with eye contact is like how much eye contact. Like, don't people get creeped out when you just stare into their souls for like 5 minutes at a time?
Well, um, actually, yes, but only if you stare at them for like literally 5 minutes. If you just never break eye contact and you just don't blink, they'll feel, like a void that is like your eyes. They need to like stare into this thing. But, in actuality, it really doesn't have a negative impact. They really don't think that way. They won't be, unless you are creepy about it. It will not
Yeah, please do
be
not be
creepy.
creepy about it.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah. Argument clinic advice number one: try not to be creepy in debate rounds. But we don't think that eye contact is really something that should really concern you much here. Look down at whatever you use to take notes for the debate slash flow the debate. Um, Obviously, to get your arguments and stuff like that, feel free to look at your piece of evidence and your criterion to refamiliarize with stuff to break eye contact a little bit. But for the most part, you should try to be looking at them and maintaining eye contact as much as possible. Now,
Yeah, And if you like watch the best speech tellers like on YouTube, like for example Obama, like he looks down occasionally at his notes and whatever, but he's pretty good about looking into the crowd and getting a little bit of eye contact in here and there. And by a little bit, I mean a lot. So the sort of next part about ethos is just straight up sounding like you're right. Confidence is just really, really important. No debater or judge, really feels threatened by a debater that just has no confidence. But debaters who are debating other debaters who have confidence are, a little less sure of themselves. They're like, wow, that person's really confident. Maybe they really know what they're talking about. I'm probably going to lose this debate. And judges, when they're watching this debate, a lot of times they're just they vote for the person who has more confidence. And they just don't vote for debaters who are unsure. Confidence is just an easy step to getting judges to vote for you, convincing them that you're right. If you act like you're right, a lot of times you can convince people that you are right. They have to believe in someone. They have to vote for someone. So you should just make it you. Be more confident. Be the person they want to vote for.
Lawrence, do you want to hear my theory about sort of confidence and the way that it works with judges?
Sure, go for it.
Well, so I think that there are a lot of judges that, and these can be parent judges, these can be other types of judges, but basically I think that they don't really know how it's possible to technically evaluate, a debate, technically, in air quotes here.
Yeah.
However, I do think that they think that the debaters know who wins. So one thing that I think that judges do a lot of times is use self-confidence as kind of like a proxy for who is winning the debate. Because, for example, imagine, you are a parent judge, and you're sitting there and you're thinking, oh, God, these people are all making a bunch of arguments on both sides. I don't really know which arguments are more right. However, one debater, right, is really confident. And then the other debater is not confident at all. And in fact, whenever the other debater makes a good point, the other debater kind of looks defeated. Now, if I didn't know how to evaluate the debate, I would just think both of the debaters think that one of them is winning.
Yeah, exactly.
So if that's true, and a lot of judges with not a lot of experience, they're like, I'm going to defer to the debaters on this issue. And I think that in the case of parent judges, I think one of the main reasons for that is actually that, parent judges are parents of debaters, usually. And
Yeah.
when their child comes home from a tournament, they always talk about how they got some bad judge that didn't vote for them or whatever. And so as a consequence of that, parent judges are nervous people. They are nervous about their ability to judge rounds. And I don't think that their nervousness is necessarily that warranted, because I think they don't really realize that every other parent judge is kind of in the same boat. But one thing that does is they put a lot of stock in what debaters know about things. So self-confidence can be really important, because if you're confident in a debate round, a judge is just more likely to think that, you know what's going on, that you know who won and it was you. And there are sort of countless stories, by the way. Sorry to cut you off, Lawrence. There are tons of stories of people who won a round almost entirely because of confidence.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I can't tell you how many rounds that I've watched my dad judge, where at the end of it, he's just like, yeah, that debater was more confident than the other one. Now, that's obviously not the sole reasoning, but I think, as Martin pointed out, it's a useful proxy towards figuring out who is the better debater, because my dad will occasionally reference when he judges, well, that debater just seemed more sure of himself, so I think he was more right. And I think the other debater thought they were losing the debate too, and that made me less likely to vote for them. And so he actually does sort of reverse engineer some of these rounds. And I think confidence is a very useful proxy for figuring that out.
My dad's problem as a judge was that my junior year he only voted affirmative, because I had taught him some wrong lessons about how to debate. I basically said, "Oh, I lost a bunch of times, even though my opponents, conceded my arguments." And I think from that, my dad got the wrong impression that the first person to concede an argument is kind of on the back foot / lost the debate. So as a consequence of that, I think that when my dad was judging rounds, the affirmative would just stand up in their first affirmative rebuttal and say, well, it sounds like you didn't answer this one argument that I made. And then my dad would be like, oh, I guess that's probably true. You win. He didn't exactly do that, but I think that that's kind of what it boiled down to a bunch of times. It was only when I made fun of him for voting affirmative in every single round, regardless of debater quality, and then eventually I sat him down and forced him to watch videos where the negatives clearly won their debates, and then he got the picture. Not to knock my dad. My dad was actually like a fairly solid parent judge, at least my senior year, but my junior year,
especially if you're affirmative, yeah.
Yeah, my junior year, I had this. There was this good debater from one of my local schools, and she said, "I have your dad as your judge at some local tournament against someone who was random, I think." And I said, "What side are you?" And she's like, "Negative." I'm like, "You're gonna lose." And she's like, "What?" I'm like, "My dad only votes affirmative. This is not good for you." I'm like, "Hey, try to overcome it." And she lost. He voted against her. I was like, "Oh."
Rough.
Oh, Nelly.
So that might be one instance where confidence may not sell it in its entirety. You might just have to be affirmative to win. But I think for
Yeah.
the vast majority of other judges, confidence will help you win regardless of whether or not you're affirmative or negative.
Yeah.
So I think
Can you talk about perceptual dominance? What does that term mean? What is perceptual dominance? This is still under ethos, by the way.
Yeah, so I think everyone sort of has heard this term to some degree. I heard it like probably my sophomore year, just like, you have perceptual dominance. I was like, what is this? Like, I'm sophomore, I don't know what's going on. And it's kind of hard to pin down what perceptual dominance is. And I think one of the reasons for why this term is thrown around a lot and just sort of used is because there isn't really a singular defining feature of perceptual dominance. I think it's like a mix of things. And I think the easiest way to describe it is just like, find someone you think is good at debate and then figure out why you think they're winning these debate rounds, especially when you're not flowing. Like, what are they doing when you are not flowing this debate round and you're just sort of watching them debate? What are they doing that sort of conveys that they are winning? So like, perceptual dominance obviously just means the perception of being dominant, right? Like, you appear dominant to the judge. And it's an important feature to have, as we sort of talked about a lot earlier, because confidence is a self proxy, or is like an easy proxy for judges to figure out who's winning. If you look like you're winning, they're more likely to vote for you, et cetera, et cetera. It becomes harder to tell you what is perceptual dominance because there is no singular defining feature. But I think if you sort of watch good debaters, you'll eventually figure it out.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Basically, all of my tips on perceptual dominance have just come from watching debaters who I think are good and being like, ooh, I'll use that. I think perceptual dominance is just when everyone thinks you're winning, and everyone here means the audience too.
Yeah.
A lot of things can incline us in that direction, and I basically just completely agree with Lawrence that you should just sneak a peek at some good judges. Take some time watching good debaters debate. If you're at a tournament with elimination rounds, and you are not in those rounds, or not in anymore, to be optimistic, you should go and watch some of the best debaters at the tournament, debaters who did the best in preliminary rounds, or you've heard a buzz about around the tournament about the fact that this person's really good. You might learn some skills from these people. And also, there are a lot of sort of videos on the internet that you can watch, as Lawrence said earlier.
Yeah, so when I was maybe a junior or senior, the debater that I watched the most was Danny Dubois, which is kind of interesting because Danny is actually younger than I am, but we were in the same grade, I suppose. And I thought that Danny, a lot of the times, was sort of the example of perceptual dominance in a lot of his debate rounds. And I think there's a lot of features about Danny that sort of give him the perception of winning, but I think the few things that I can point to off the top of my head were that Danny never acted like he was losing. He was always very calm and in control. I think he made good arguments for sure, but I think he just never acted like he was losing. He was just always, the calm, in control, spoke the same way, confident debater. And I think that was sort of the defining feature of what made Danny Dubois perceptually dominant. Now, other people might think Danny was perceptually dominant for other reasons, but for me, those were the sort of things that convinced me that he was always winning the debate, no matter what.
He just probably
And
was.
and
Let's be honest.
yeah,
He probably
uh,
was winning
and,
the debate.
but most likely, he was actually really really good at debate. And so like just watching these debate rounds and figuring out what makes these debaters perceptually dominant to you, and then sort of incorporating those techniques into your debating skills, I think is really really important.
Yeah, that's some good stuff. Um, Go into the types of judges that you think that we'll get. So I think that there are a couple of judges types that we've already talked about on the podcast, and we're going to start with one that we've talked about at length already, kind of the mom and dad variety. But it's very important to get a read on who your judge is, like what type of judge they are. Some of these judges, though, cross into multiple categories. And one thing that we definitely want to stress is even if you think that your judge is one of these things, don't sort of use that to completely overdetermine what type of judge they are. Because there are a lot of different types of moms and dads. There are a lot of different types of traditional judges. So still use your judgment in the debate to adapt to specific people. But these are some good heuristics that you can use if you don't really know much about the judge. So I'm going to talk about mom judges and dad judges for a while. So there are basically, I think, three main types of parent judges. The first type is the kind of really experienced parent judges. These ones are kind of rare, but some parents, because maybe they have multiple kids in debate, really stay judging for kind of years and years. And some of them become really good judges, just kind of straight up. Not even just for your local circuit. I think, for example, when I was debating, my best friend was named Brian Wilder. And he didn't go to my high school, but we traveled together and prepped together. So we basically were a team. And before I started debating with Brian, I was able to debate on our local circuit in front of his dad. And the thing about his dad was, if you didn't know his dad, you would have no idea. But his dad was actually just an incredibly good judge. And it was so weird because his dad was not only an incredibly good judge by our local circuit standards, but was just a great judge like at national tournaments. Like he was just a really good judge at national tournaments. And we would, prefer him when we would go to out-of-state national tournaments because he was just actually just an awesome judge. So it can be important to note that some judges and that are parents are also just really good judges. Now, I don't think, and I think Lawrence will agree with me on this, I really don't think you should assume that this is the type of parent judge that you got, even if
Oh
they
yeah,
say that they're great.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, because you might lose if you assume that they're a really experienced judge and then do things that you shouldn't. But you're not going to lose if you assume that they're not an experienced judge and just do the core persuasive things that we've been talking about. Just appealing to trying to only go for the really experienced ones is probably not a great recipe for success.
Yeah, you really have to have a pretty big body of knowledge about who this person is by talking to a lot of people and trying to figure it out or being judged by them multiple times. That's really the way that you can tell that they're good. So I think the second type of parent judges are, I'll call them the note takers. So the thing is, and I say note taking because as most of you know, in debate, there's this thing that we use to keep track of arguments. We call it flowing. It's debate note taking. But I think that some parent judges just don't know the word, or even if they have been the word, they haven't exposed to it. So there were a lot of judges at my local circuit that came in with sort of like like a half-sized like flower book sort of notepad that they would
Yeah,
take
yeah.
out, and it was like sort of like half a page in length, and they would try to maybe if they were frisky they'd go into multiple pages, but some of them would just try to just write down stuff about the entire debate on this one page. And the thing is, they're writing stuff down, things that you did, sometimes even arguments that you were making, sometimes not, and you really had no way of knowing. And basically all the stuff that we talked about, pathos, logos, and ethos, are the way that you would appeal to those judges. There's not too much that you know about them, but you do know that, for example, they aren't going to have an immaculate record of the debate. They're not going to know exactly who said what when. They're only going to remember, some stuff that you said, not all of it. So it's important to emphasize a couple things, and we'll get to that later. But these are really the majority of judges. These are sort of the bread and butter parent judges on the local circuit. I assume, Lawrence, that you've had like a bunch of those that
Yeah,
you were familiar
absolutely.
with.
That's
Yeah.
most likely the majority of the rounds that I had in Oklahoma were judged by the quote note takers.
Yeah. I loved me some note takers. I'd be like, you better write this down, and they would write it down. It was great. Um, so there's the next type of parent judge is what I'll call the starers. And I think that some of us, we've only had a few of these people, but they really stick out in our minds. These are people that maybe they brought a notepad into the room, but they don't write on it at all. They just stare you in the eyes for your entire speech, for the entire debate. They just look at you right in the face. I had one judge who was a daddy judge. He stared at me kind of open-mouthed and my opponent for the entire debate. Didn't write down a single word. And, basically, for those people, you really want to take everything that we've said and, like, max it out to the extreme. One thing that I would do in front of those people, by the way, I don't think I ever lost a judge that was a stare. And that's because I just looked at them in the eyes, I put down my flow, and I just turned it on. I just turned on the persuasiveness, and I didn't stop. And in my rebuttal speeches, and maybe even in the first speech, I really only made like 2 arguments max, like total. But I told the story of those arguments. I looked at him in the face. I made hand gestures. There were a lot of things that I tried to do, and I just only wanted him to get 1 point. I was like, I'd like you to understand the following thing, and I'm going to make this as clear to you as it is possible to make it clear to a human being. And the reason why you have to do this, by the way, is not because the judge is stupid. In fact, some of these judges can be smart people, but the problem is they aren't writing down anything. And I don't know if you've tried to like watch a debate round where you don't write down anything, but even for us experienced people, it can be difficult to remember who said what and the various flows of who said various things. So the thing is, even if you made a great point, if they don't remember it, it doesn't matter. And if they aren't writing down things, they really aren't going to remember a lot of stuff. So you really just have to say 1 point, and then after the debate, maybe the fact that you talked about it for 4 minutes will mean that they remember it.
I hope they remember it at least. If they don't remember that, I'm not sure what they would remember.
I was actually talking about Brian, and his dad was a really good parent judge. I actually debated Brian a bunch of times on the local circuit, and our debates were always really fun because we're the best of friends. But most of them were, what we call lay debates. Most of them were debates in front of parents, and we had a round in front of a starer. And Brian was making like a couple points, and Brian was way more logical than I was, but I really had the pathos on him. So what I did was I would in front of this round, which I very vividly remember, I just made 1 argument. For the entirety of my second affirmative rebuttal, I only made 1 argument. And I was just like, look, Judge, if you're going to vote for me, it's going to be on this argument. My goal is to make you understand this argument with your heart and your mind as much as humanly possible. And look, the 2N, they said a lot of stuff that you aren't going to remember because you weren't writing it down. I didn't actually say that. But I was like, look, the really important thing that matters is this 1 argument, and I don't even remember what it was. But I just said, this is the 1 argument that I'd like you to really think about. And he voted for me on it. It was glorious.
That is a story I cannot replicate because I don't think I've ever once done that. But it definitely makes sense in that instance. Like I don't think I've had very many stares, but if I were to encounter one, I feel like that's a very reasonable way to approach it. Like, they're not writing stuff down. Let's just sell the story, and it works.
So I have a lot of experience with mom judges. There are a lot of them in specifically Florida where I debated, and not a lot of I would classify traditional judges. There were actually not very many of those. I think Lawrence has better experience with those people than I do. So why don't you take us away on those?
Yeah, so we have the mom and dads, the parents, and I think the sort of next classification of judges are sort of traditional people, people who, are involved in debate. They are, but they mostly just do sort of slower traditional debate. And I think the sort of two broad categories of judges are actual debate coaches and former traditional LD style debaters.
Before we get
So,
into that, what does the word traditional mean in the context of
ah, so
traditional debate?
So for me, it typically refers to, the type of debate that you would see at NSDA nationals or maybe NCFL nationals. It's the sort of, very value focused debate. It's very much modeled on the old style of Abraham Lincoln versus, good
Hmm.
old Douglas, Lincoln versus Douglas. And I think it's focused on persuasion. I think it's focused on sort of moral, ethical arguments. I think it's focused on, just persuasiveness in general. I think it's a little bit distinct from what people would classify as national circuit debate, where people tend to talk faster, read more different types of evidence, and have a wider variety of arguments that they sort of engage in. But I think traditional debate is just like what you would imagine like a fairly audience-friendly debate to look like.
When I think
Between
traditional debate, I think old school. Is that wrong?
Yeah. Um, Maybe I tend to think of it less as like old school because like I think traditional debate still evolves a little bit over time. Um, but
Okay, that's fair.
but but yeah, old school I think is a reasonable way to think of it.
No, it's a good
It
point.
kind of it kind of is like that. Like when Lincoln Douglas debate was founded, it was obviously founded as sort of the alternative to people thinking policy debate got too esoteric, too inaccessible. So they founded Lincoln Douglas debate and was like, talk slow, make arguments that aren't silly, talk about ethics and stuff. And I think it is changed a little bit from that because of the national circuit. But I think traditional debate is also changing a little bit as well.
Interesting.
But so in general, I think there are two different kinds. I think they're debate coaches, and we'll talk about those first. So the thing about debate coaches is I found them in my experience in Oklahoma especially, but even when I was getting judged by them at NSDA nationals, because they pull in coaches and judges from all across the country, I found that they have different preferences, and it's hard to nail them down to any single one because each debate coach has, I think, a different vision of what sort of debate looks like, and what they think debate ought to look like. So, for example, I think in Oklahoma, especially on the eastern side of Oklahoma, which debates a little bit differently than the western side, there is an excessive focus on value criterions. And so, like, other regions may not care so much about the value criterion or the framework. But I think in Oklahoma, there was much more of that. Like, every judge, every coach expected you at the end of this debate to have at least 5 or so minutes total dedicated to just talking about the different value criterions that were in this round. So, for example, the affirmative talks about sort of utilitarian ethics and why we should focus on the greater good. The negative might talk about sort of autonomy and why we should protect individuals' autonomy. And they expected you to have a long debate about that. When in some other regions, that might not be the case. They might just expect you to have a very short value criterion and engage straight into the contention debate. And I think it's hard to pin down because I think it's so regionally variant. But I think to adapt to debate coaches, it's just figuring out what their preferences are and sort of adapting to those norms. I think debate coaches are less persuaded by the pathos side of things than your mom and dad style people are, but and they care a little bit more, I think, about the logos and ethos side. But
Hmm.
obviously, they're still humans. You should still not give up on pathos. Remember, you can't be a good basketball player if all you can do is dribble and shoot, but you can't pass or something like that. So I think that's sort of the trick to adapting to debate coaches. Uh, so the second sort of category are just sort of former traditional LD debaters. And I think this was probably the type of judge that I got most often. So people who had just like debated in Oklahoma and were going to college in Oklahoma and so came back on the weekends to judge at local LD debate tournaments. And I found that these types of judges are the most heavily influenced by their personal background because they had, when they were in high school, their personal conception of what debate should look like. Like, I think debate should just mostly be about Kant, or I think debate should mostly just talk about international relations, or I think that debate should care less about empirics and we should just talk more about abstract ethics, or just like random things like that. Or interestingly enough, there's a few debaters that like get really into like they're college majors. So if they become philosophy majors, they become super into that one type of philosophy that they're reading in college. And so they're like, I want every debate to be about this like esoteric postmodern philosopher that I'm studying in my college philosophy class. And they just get super heavily influenced by that. And so and for that reason, it's a little bit harder to adapt to them because it's hard to figure out exactly what they are now. But I found that it's not that hard to adapt to them, especially if you knew them before. So like the judge that, for example, at the beginning I talked about just nodded a lot during that one speech in state finals my senior year. I knew that he really liked, like more abstract ethical arguments about the framework more so than the average judge. Like that was almost always consistently on his ballot. So I would make sure that was something that I brought up in every single debate in front of him. And so just figuring out what their personal backgrounds are and sort of figuring out what they like, I think is really important. I think the second thing about former traditional LD debaters is that they tend to think they're good judges. And because they're like, wow, I was really good at debate. I know how to judge. And they also have like thoughts about the sort of good old days. And they're like, back in my days, we actually engaged in these arguments. Or back in my days, we had discussions about Kantian philosophy more so than now. Or back in my day. And they sort of like, we weren't bad at debate back then. And so they sort of like, they think like that, and they're heavily influenced by their personal thoughts about what debate is. And so I'd say the trick to beating that is to sort of make them feel like they're back in the good old days and that you're just embodying everything that they think is good about debate. And once you sort of do that, I think you're in a pretty good position. Like, so there's one judge that really disliked the use of the word turn in debate for some reason. Like, I think they thought it was too much like policy debate. And so I would just, emphatically refuse to use the word turn anywhere in my speeches. And I think I can't remember the details, but at one point in time, I think I called out an opponent for sort of like using the word turn. I was like, that's just too jargon heavy for Lincoln Douglas debate. And that's not how the founders of Lincoln Douglas debate would want it to be, or something along those lines. And the judge like nodded along with that because you made them feel like we're back in the good old days. We're fighting the sort of new evolution of debate. Or something like that. I think that former traditional LD debaters are also pretty heavily influenced by logos and ethos more so than pathos. But I don't think you should ignore the pathos side. I think that you can easily win debates with just having more pathos than the other debater when you're debating in front of these judges.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I've definitely experienced a couple of those former LD debaters that think that they're very good judges. There were a couple that I was very good at adapting to. And one thing about this that goes back to something that Lawrence said earlier is you can really make these people feel good about themselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you are adapting to them and you treat them as if they are the good judges that they think that they are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Like make them feel like they're good judges.
And one of the thing about that though is that really some of these people were good judges because once you knew how to adapt to them, they could judge around very objectively, very sort of logically. So I gained a lot of respect for traditional judges, even though I didn't have that many of them, based on debating in front of a lot of former debaters. And that was really a really good experience for me. Now, I think that the next major group of judges, so there's public forum judges. We're not going to talk with those as much. Some of them are entered in the Lincoln Douglas pool a lot of times. I'm not really going to talk about public forum judges as much. I would say that usually a lot of what we've just said about traditional judges just applies to these people. The only difference is that in public forum debate, there are some conventions that are maybe a little less conventional that they subscribe to, at least to us. And it's difficult sometimes for us to really know what those are in advance. But if you are able to get judged by them a lot more times, then you can eventually figure out a lot of that stuff. The best advice for public forum judges is kind of just like, good luck, debate in front of them as if they're a former debater, traditional judge, something like that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk a little bit also about policy judges. I think that these ones are grouped into a couple of different categories. First of all, there are some people who did policy debate a long time ago. Like they did policy debate in like 1970 or something like that. For all intents and purposes, these judges are traditional LD judges, especially if they've judged LD a couple of other times. They're very similar. They have ideas about what debate should be back when they've debated a long time ago. Some of them even think that because they did debate a long time ago, they would make good judges now. That may or may not be true, and it's difficult to know going in, but you should basically treat them kind of like traditional judges. I would talk about philosophy a little less, given that in policy debate, I don't know how much of you really know about policy debate, but there's very little philosophy in it, at least of the sort of like ethical philosophy that we think of, like Kant, utilitarianism, etc. There are other types of policy judges, the ones that I would say are more modern, and these judges basically are just very influenced by logos and ethos, but mostly logos, as I would say. And the way that you should debate in front of these people, you should de-emphasize a lot of the philosophical components, and the contention debate is really what they want to see. That's really what you want to do when you're debating in front of these judges. Now, if you want... Here's the thing about policy judges. Policy judges will basically always flow the debate perfectly. Another thing about policy judges that's very interesting is in LD, it used to be that if you wanted to know, sort of have a good heuristic for whether or not a judge was sort of up to the times and sort of, hep to the new teen lingo with respect to debate, one thing that people tended to use a lot was kind of age. And the idea that like maybe some of the older judges aren't as good. Now, first of all, I never really think that was a good standard to use. Sometimes it's all you have and you got to use it, but basically I don't think that was ever really that right. There were a lot of old judges who were actually great. But one thing that policy debate really teaches you is that there are a lot of judges in policy debate who are older and very talented. So really, just because a judge is old, and if they say they currently do policy debate, they're probably a great judge. And you can probably go really hard for some of the logo stuff.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Would you have anything to add there, Lawrence?
No, I think this like pretty much covers it all.
Okay. So next thing, and we'll only talk about this for a short period of time because we're really not a podcast that's super designed for this. But so circuit LD judges. The word circuit just kind of like means there are people that travel to a bunch of national tournaments and a lot of weekends during the year to compete against people around the country. That's what we just mean by circuit, just like the tournaments that you would go to in order is kind of like the circuit, and the people that compete on it are the circuit. And basically what circuit LD judges means is people that did sort of national style Lincoln Douglas debate or coaching. And there's a huge amount of variation in these people that we're really not going to talk about.
Right. I think it's sort of beyond the scope of what we think adaption is about. I think the sort of one thing that we'll just add about circuit LD judges is you don't have to talk fast to win in front of them because most circuit LD judges, I would guess, don't really think that speed itself is persuasive. It's just a tool to get more arguments out there. I think that's a common misconception that people have, and I think it's one thing that we sort of want to point out, that when you're adapting to these people, you don't have to talk fast.
I remember I judged a debate at one of the more prestigious national tournaments around the country in Chicago, and it was a debate between a very talented debater from the Bronx High School of Science and a guy from Wyoming, as he said in the debate. And he sort of made a couple preliminary arguments. Most of them were arguments that he had just sort of written out himself, kind of jotted down, about why debaters shouldn't speak particularly quickly in debates. And this argument that debaters shouldn't speak very quickly, I had seen it a number of times and it hadn't been very successful. However, in this debate, the Bronx High School of Science debater didn't really capitalize very much on answering the argument very well. So this debater from sort of self-described local debater from Wyoming just extended his arguments that debaters shouldn't speak very fast, and I actually awarded him the win, much to the surprise of the Bronx High School of Science debater, who is very talented and is now an amazing judge. So she know who she is. But so that just proves that you don't need to speak incredibly quickly to win in front of these judges. Okay. Before we conclude this episode, we'd like to give a special thanks to our sponsor for the podcast, Victory Briefs. Victory Briefs is a stellar camp and has evidence packets, summer institutes that you can go to work at, and a website full of the best and most up-to-date debate news. Go there for camp to get some of the best instruction in the nation, in spite of myself being there. You can check victorybriefs.com for all the stuff on that. It's a great place and everything's top-notch. We very much recommend it.
Yeah, I work at Victory Briefs every summer, and the reason I continue to work there is because I truly believe that it's one of the best debate camps in the country, and that it really cares about the students, and it really provides an educational experience that very few other places can even come close to matching.
Okay, so that's the episode for this week. Thank you all so much for joining us. We hope that this can become a regular bi-weekly thing, where we post, once every other week. We have a kind of longish episode about this, where we lay into the really deep details of LD debate, and we just sort of sit here, have a good time, tell some stories, and figure out how to improve all of our skills at Lincoln Douglas debate. So now we're going to move into the ending segment of the podcast, where we have sort of a little mini debate on topics that are completely actually, never mind. They're so relevant. These topics are very, very relevant, as I'm sure that Lawrence will agree with me. So
I only agree reluctantly.
Reluctantly. That's how I like people to agree to the things that I say. Reluctantly. So okay, let's have the debate. I am going to say we should debate about what is the best berry.
Oh
now,
no.
I'll lead us off. Blackberry. I'm going to defend blackberry being the greatest berry. It's really sour. It's really substantive. There's more of it, than a raspberry, which I also like. But I think that blackberries are objectively the best berry.
Are you referring to the electronic device that is the BlackBerry? Or
unfortunately not. Although I think that's much less tasty than a physical blackberry. Although, I don't want to speak for you.
okay, well, from what I understand, I think that blueberries might actually be the best berry. I'm reading this article.
Rookie mistake.
I'm reading this article from the Huffington Post, which is entitled "The Best Berries for Your Health." I think it demonstrates that Huffington Post may have better things to write about. But apparently, blueberries is near the top of this list. It is they're called blue dynamos, and they're packed with manganese and 4 grams of fiber per cup, vitamin K. They're apparently they can help fight diseases like cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. It is very interesting that someone decided to compile a list of the best berries and their health and their health.
Well, I'm still gonna go with blackberry.
That's a mistake because it's not on the list of 7 berries.
Not on the list. Well, it's clearly a glaring omission. I'll take some time to write to the author of the article and explain the error that they've made. But blackberries are clearly the tastiest berry, at least. They're at least the tastiest. Will you go with me on they're the tastiest berry? Do you like blackberries?
I actually don't think I've had a blackberry.
You don't think you've had a blackberry? You need to come down to the south, dude.
I live in Oklahoma. It's pretty southern here.
And yet you've had no blackberries. Disgraceful.
I'm trying to. What do they look like? Because when I Google
what do they
blackberry,
look like?
I'm only getting images of the phone. So I'm trying to get a picture of the actual berry itself.
Oh, you're ridiculous. How have you never had a blackberry? That's nuts. Maybe
it's a berry.
I just ate so much more. Maybe there's more blackberries in Florida than in Oklahoma. Is that a thing?
Oh, I might have actually had a blackberry before, but maybe it's part of those fruit
I'll
cups
give you a
they sell
hint.
for
They're black.
That's helpful. I feel like I've had one as part of those really ridiculously overpriced fruit cups or parfaits or whatever somewhere. So I
So
feel
you
like that
haven't
might
had
be
the
the
true
only time.
BlackBerry experience.
I guess not. Maybe my life is incomplete, but I eat blueberries, and those help fight cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. So
Well, I can't claim that blackberries necessarily fight cancer, although I would be surprised necessarily if they didn't. But I will. I'm gonna go for tastiest berry, but I think you the listeners should defer to my judgment because I've actually had blackberries.
it's a fair point. I'm by no
It
means
was a
an
life-changing
expert on this.
experience.
Well, you should decide which berry you want for yourself. We're not here to tell you which berry
No,
is
we're
actually
definitely
the
just
best.
here to just dictate to you which berries you should eat. That's actually the goal of the podcast, the sort of secret goal. Trying to get people to eat our specific type of berry. Don't listen to that blueberry propaganda that Lawrence here has given you. Anyway,
All right, so if you've
good
put up with
debate.
if you put up with the last hour and like 10 minutes that is this podcast and listen to our ridiculous blackberry versus blueberry debate,
Decisive debate. Crushed it.
I might concede that I lose because I've literally never had a blackberry, so it's hard to win.
Anyway, so you can find us on SoundCloud, iTunes, maybe Stitcher at some point. We hope that you'll join us in future Thursdays on The Argument Clinic. I guess signing off. Stay frosty.
No, this isn't an argument.
Yes, it is.
No, it isn't. It's just contradiction.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
It is not.